I will be unboxing an iPad mini 1st generation that supposedly has never been updated. And the reason I wanted this thing was because it was in the slate color, and my buddy Mac Throwback offered to sell it to me. So I bought it, and yeah, let's get this out of the box. And here's the iPad mini 1, and I'd say it's in pretty much near mint condition. There appears to be a couple scratches in some spots, but this thing looks amazing. So let's get this thing powered on, okay? And we have the older Apple logo, so that indicates that this is, of course, running iOS 6, as if this was iOS 7, it wouldn't look like this. Now, this is a Wi-Fi model, so I don't think we have to worry about any of the setup looping nonsense, so yeah. But you definitely can tell this is iOS 6 just based on how skeuomorphic everything looks. Okay, we get through activation, but of course that doesn't mean there's not a chance that this will setup loop. So yeah, let's skip the Apple ID here. Agree. I'm gonna use Siri, of course. Don't send. And we're not setup looping, and this is definitely iOS 6. It also looks like we have a very early version of iOS 6 and a 64 gig model. So yeah, this is 6.0.2. 64 gig is very cool, and so is early iOS 6. Now, I just checked the battery health on this thing, and it looks like it's at 97%, and it's not really telling me the cycle count, but I think it's about like 3 just based on what I've been told. So it's very cool. Now let's get into why the iPad mini 1st gen is so unique. First of all, it was way ahead of its time. It was the very first small iPad, launching with a 7.9-inch screen, which was very much smaller compared to the norm, which was 9.7, and here you can see it on this iOS 6 iPad 4. And it features a design that is more in line with the iPhone 5, which released the same year in 2012, featuring the diamond chamfered edge on like the edges right here, which really looks very beautiful if you like catch it in the light. And something that's super weird about this iPad mini is it even had stereo speakers, as the top of the line iPad, which was the iPad 4th gen, did not even have those. And by the way, this was pretty much the budget option in their brand new iPad lineup. It also had the brand new Lightning connector, which was a massive upgrade compared to something like the 30-pin, as not only it charged faster, it was reversible. As you can see, I can just switch it right here, and yeah. So if we compare this to the 30-pin with the iPad 3rd gen, you may also notice it has this like one little marking on the right side you need to put it in, as this was not reversible whatsoever. And it also was a lot more bigger and a lot like less convenient. It also had significantly smaller screen bezels compared to something like the iPad 4th gen, as you can see, which just pretty much reused the same design that was on the previous iPad 3 and the iPad 2 that came before it, but of course with the Lightning connector. But at the very least, these devices had brand new chips in them, as the iPad mini ended up just reusing the chip that was originally first seen in 2011 iPad 2nd gen, and it was also in the iPhone 4S, and of course that is the generic A5 chip. So of course this also means this device did not get the Retina display, and in fact it has the same res as both the iPad 2 and the 1st generation iPad, but since it has a smaller screen, it has a denser pixel per inch. So the iPad 2 had around 332 ppi, and you can very much see it is not really Retina at all. But the iPad mini had 162, but it still overall does look pretty pixelated, especially if you zoom in very closely. But overall, it does look a lot better compared to the iPad 2. And since the iPad mini also had the same chip as the iPad 2, it also meant it only got a half gig of RAM and not the full gig of RAM that was in the iPad 4. And this is very much limiting if you're trying to do something that is very taxing on the device. Like even if I just like load up a game of Minecraft, for example, if I turn up the view distance all the way, this thing feels pretty sluggish, and I'm not even all the way up with this thing. So like let's turn this up all the way, and I'm in a world that I've been working on this iPad unironically, and I don't know how hard it is to convey on this, but this feels very choppy. And since this is also the generic A5, that also means it did not get the quad-core graphics of A6X. All of this meant this thing was capped out at 9.3.5 or iOS 9.3.6, where it really does not run well at all on that version. Even by like iOS 7, which is the second major iOS update this thing got, this thing was showing the limitations of its hardware. And a good equivalent to that, if we don't have one on iOS 7, which I don't, is finding an iPad 2 on iOS 7, and it really does not run great. And to be completely honest, the only good version this device ever ran was iOS 6, so this thing was not really future-proofed whatsoever on the software and internals front. But the design was very much future-proof for this thing. And in fact, it was reused on two other iPad minis. The Mini 2, which I have, and the Mini 3, which I don't have. It was also blown up a couple sizes, and that would become the first generation iPad Air. And when you compare it to other iPads that launched around the same time and next to it, you can very much see how much thought they put into like future-proofing this design and that they were going to use it into the future. And this thing really does feel futuristic. Because even on something like the iPad 6th gen, which only got a couple tweaks to its design because it overall just reused the same thing as the iPad Air 2, which also sort of tweaked this design, but the only real difference is that it just got a slightly thinner look and a slightly different speaker design. So technically you could say that this design was used for like forever but was modified a couple times, and like this is the iPad 6th gen, by the way. This came out in 2018. But of course this was the budget option in 2012, starting at about $329 for the base 16 gig. In comparison to the iPad 4, that started at like $500. And to be honest, for the futuristic design and the A5 chip, this wasn't that bad for people on a budget. Now back to the design again. All base model iPads up until 2012 only came with an option for having color on the bezels of the iPad, with silver on the back shell, and these like volume buttons and side buttons were always black. And if you had a cellular one, this like antenna bar up here, that was also always black, even if you had one in white. So just to show you, here is a white iPad 3rd gen, and you can see that and that. But this was very different on the iPad mini, of course, as now the color covered the whole entire back shell and the volume buttons, and also the antenna thing. So here is a silver iPad mini on iOS 6, and you can see the front bezels are also white. And of course for the Slate one, you can see it right here, and the front bezels are also black. It of course came in two color options, black and slate and white and silver. But later on, slate was replaced with space gray due to durability reasons. As like if you slightly dropped this thing or like accidentally hit this on a table, for example, it would 100% chip. In my opinion, slate 100% looks better. Like, it's not even close. Although I think they should have just refined slate, but I guess in that way, space gray is just a refined slate that is more durable, but it really doesn't even look as good at all. Like, it just looks garbage. The volume rocker also ended up being replaced with two separate buttons. As if we compare this to something like the iPad 2, which I have right here, it is one huge button with like two ends that you would press down on, basically. And it was replaced with like two metal buttons, which overall does look a bit better in my opinion. And another unique thing about this iPad is the camera. The iPad 2, which this thing is based off internally mostly, had an absolute garbage camera with sub-megapixel quality on both the front and rear camera. But this thing ended up getting a full 5-megapixel camera on the rear and a 1.2 megapixel front camera, which is sort of more in line with the iPhone 4 and iPhone 4S, although the iPhone 4S does have a 8 megapixel rear facing camera. This of course was an absolute massive improvement, and you can just see it from the front camera right here. This looks significantly better on the iPad mini versus the iPad 2. But it would have been absolutely nuts if they kept that like sub-megapixel quality camera in 2012. And it even got a very early version of 4G LTE on this thing, while the iPad 2 of course had 3G only. Which is kind of weird, because you think if they were trying to keep the exact same internals, they could have just not done that and kept 3G on this thing for the cellular models. The battery is also pretty small on this thing, of course due to it having both a smaller and thinner design compared to something like the iPad 2 or the iPad 4. And also it didn't even have the Retina display if we're comparing this to the iPad 4. So this thing has a battery with around 4,500 milliamp hours, which is quite comparable to something like the modern iPhone 17 lineup, with I think the iPhone 17 Pro is around this amount of milliamp hours, if I'm not mistaken. In comparison to something like the iPad 2, that got about 7,000 milliamp hours. And if we're comparing this to the Retina iPad 4 and iPad 3, they had a battery with about 11,560 milliamp hours, which actually is quite a lot bigger compared to more modern iPads like the Air 1, Air 2, and iPad 5, and even the iPad 6. I bet the iPad 4 compared to some other new iPad batteries is even better, but I'm not really gonna throw that in my script. Now let's talk about iOS 6 on this device. iOS 6 is really the last of its time and is very unique. First of all, it's the last iOS version to have Apple's classic and older skeuomorphic design. If you do not know what skeuomorphism is, it's basically a design that mimics real-life objects. You can see this in things like the Notepad application, which looks like a real notepad. The camera app's icon, which looks like a real camera lens. And when you open it up, it has this like some sort of like shades or shade type of animation, if that's what you call them. I have no idea. Which in recent times has sort of made a return with iOS 26's clay looking recreation. And you can also see this with the overall linen style that is used throughout the OS with things like folders. And I could probably go through like 10 more things on this thing because this iOS is so detailed, but I'm not going to. But anyway, we all know a year later, Apple replaced this with flat design. But you may ask, what is their main reason for redesigning their whole entire operating system? Well, with the launch of Apple Maps on iOS 6 came a massive controversy, mainly because it was super buggy. A good way I can show you this is just by looking at the icon, as it just shows someone driving off an overpass. But other than that, inside of the app, there was so many bugs. The lead dev of Apple Maps in 2012 was a dude named Scott Forstall, and he was not your ordinary dude that just made the Maps app. No, he was the lead designer of majority of Apple's skeuomorphic era, of course iOS 1 through 6. But with the massive controversy that came with the absolute horrid state of Apple Maps, Apple wanted to apologize to see if they could probably minimize some of the outrage. So Timmy Cook wrote up an apology letter and wanted Scott to sign it, which, I mean, he refused. And the result of that was somewhat of a culmination of past things that had happened. Ever since the death of Steve Jobs, Scott didn't really have anyone to advocate for his skeuomorphic designs. You see, Steve was a massive advocate for skeuomorphism, and Tim Cook was not really as pro-skeo as him. And Forstall frequently clashed with the hardware designer at the time, Jony Ive, which he will come into picture in a minute, and other top executives at Apple. And this was sort of the final straw between Tim and Scott, which they would fire and replace with Jony Ive. Now, Jony Ive was the biggest advocate for flat and minimalist designs. So the following year came the biggest visual redesign Apple has ever done. And I'd argue it's bigger than Liquid Glass and iOS 11. And if you do not know about iOS 11's redesign, it's pretty much where they just rounded everything off to accommodate for things like the iPhone X. Now, everything was completely minimalist, from things that we just looked at a second ago, like this notepad, which is still semi-skeuomorphic because it has a very slight texture there, but overall it's not really skeuomorphic in my opinion, just because it's not mimicking anything else here. But that's just kind of early flat design for you. The camera icon is also not really mimicking anything, and they removed all of the like linen designs in the folders. And iOS 7 became one of the most controversial updates ever, as it pushed everyone towards the flat era. Not just Apple, they just kind of influenced everyone to do the same thing as them. But the annoying thing about iOS 7, despite its like masterclass and beautiful version of flat design, is it allows everyone to become lazy on what they design. We still are facing the effects of this update to this day with the constant minimization, but we are now kind of moving towards a post-flat era of some sorts, where everything is becoming less flat and more fun, but of course it's not going to replicate the charm of things like iOS 7, Android Lollipop, and Metro for like early flat design, and it's also not going to replicate the beautiful and very detailed skeuomorphic era, with designs like pre-2014 macOS, Aero Glass, and other things like Frutiger Aero, although Aero Glass is Frutiger Aero. But anyway, now let's just talk about some of the other things in iOS 6 that aren't the design in Apple Maps, which I do not think we need to go over again after we just explained why it's an absolute horrid dumpster fire. Siri got expanded massively, which for some reason is on the iPad mini 1, even with it having the same chip as the iPad 2, which did not get Siri. But anyway, it could tell you things like sports scores. Siri, tell me MLB scores.
There are 10 MLB games for today.
And there you go, it pulls it all up. And it could also tell you things about movies, but I'm not really going to experiment with that. Siri, tell me a joke.
I'm taking these cookies to the doctor. They feel crummy.
Wow, super creative. Anyway, it could also like do things like posting tweets, post on Facebook, and it also could launch apps. So let's try that right now. Siri, launch the camera app.
Doesn't look like you have an app named Camera.
What? Okay, let's try that again. Siri, launch Minecraft.
It doesn't look like you have an app named Minecraft.
Wow, it just doesn't care. Okay, maybe I have to try this. Siri, launch Minecraft PE.
I don't see an app called Minecraft.
Well, I guess you're just f***ing retarded. It's probably just as smart as modern Apple intelligence. And speaking of Facebook, it was completely integrated into iOS 6. As you can see, I can sign into it right from settings, although I doubt it still works. Do Not Disturb was added, which, by the way, this is not the mate of iOS 6 multitasking. I have a tweak from Cydia. But anyway, Do Not Disturb was like the feature where you can silence all notifications and incoming phone calls if you had a phone. Phone calls were also improved, as you could reply with a message when declining a phone call with just one button, or hit the remind me later button when declining a call, as you could set a reminder for when you can call them back later. The Passbook app was also added, which is not on iPad, where you could store things like boarding passes, tickets, and coupons, which was pretty much a precursor to Apple Wallet. iOS 6 also got some privacy improvements. If you have ever seen the notifications where they ask for your location or to track you when you open up an app, and you can either decline or approve, well, in iOS 6, this is where it was implemented. As on prior iOS versions, they could silently track you on some like 1984 type shit. Safari also got some improvements with things like the offline reading list and iCloud tabs, which are absolutely huge, as you can now see open pages on all of your devices, and landscape mode was added for other devices that aren't an iPad, and specifically Safari. And the Mail app got some improvements with the VIP mailbox, where you could access emails from people you find important. Flagged emails was also added, and pull down to refresh was also added. And the Clock app was also added to the iPad. On all previous iPads, there was no Clock app whatsoever, but when they added it, you may notice they did not reuse the Clock app icon from iPhone and iPod Touch. The design of this Clock app originally came from Swiss Federal Railways, and Apple ended up having to pay $20 million just for them to use it for a year. As we all know, iOS 7 came right after. The classic YouTube app, which you can see on iOS 4 right here, was also removed from iOS 6, as Google wanted people on iOS to download their separate YouTube app from the App Store. This all kind of stems from Apple and Google's relationship souring and them becoming competitors, as when the first iPhone released with iPhone OS 1 back in 2007, Apple and Google were very close partners. So when the licensing agreement between both companies expired, and then the old YouTube app just disappeared. And to be honest, it kind of sucks. I can't lie, that old YouTube app with the retro like TV looking icon is so classic. But anyway, that's all for the history. Let's just explore the device some more. The first thing let's look at is the wallpapers, as iOS 6, to be completely honest, had a pretty weak wallpaper selection. There is only like maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 wallpapers. Actually, make that 5 and 6. 6 wallpapers out of like the 20-ish wallpapers they put on this thing. This one, which actually doesn't look bad with slate, but I really like these ones, which were from iOS 5. This one's from iOS 5. This one's from iOS 4. This one's an ocean wallpaper, which is from like iOS 3, I believe. And this one's, I don't think, came from iOS 6. So all of these new ones really just don't stack up to the older ones that they kept, but they removed a ton of them that were originally on like iOS 4 and 5, like this classic iPad exclusive iPhone OS 3 wallpaper, this earth wallpaper, and like these other flower wallpapers, which they removed. Let's also quickly go through the ringtones. Let's also go through the alert tones. I think I'm gonna put on this one. Also, with the jailbreak I used on this thing, it imports like the classic weather app onto iPad, which usually it isn't here natively, obviously, as that was added way later. But it's cool, we can go look at it. We can take a look at the classic game center with all the green felt, and the photo booth application, which I remember really liking back in the day. And here's the classic music application if you're curious on what that looks like. I also fixed YouTube for this thing. As you can see, everything loads up fine. And I also got a ton of games on this thing, like Flappy Bird, Minecraft, which I did mention. I've been playing on this one world for like weeks now, and I've got quite a bit of stuff done here. So like, let's go through here. Like, I've built some houses and everything, another house. And then over here, I built like another town area. And I have a ton of other nostalgic games on here. So if you want me to game on this thing at some point and make a video out of that, comment down below. Also, if any of you were jailbreakers back in the day, and I still am, of course, here is what Cydia looked like. Now, let's get to the jailbreak process of this iPad mini 1. Make sure to not skip, because it's going to be interesting. And of course, since this is an A5 device, I'm going to need an Arduino. So let me connect this thing up to my Linux computer. And the Arduino will only be needed for the portion of me saving SHSH blobs, as because I don't usually jailbreak before I save SHSH blobs, because I just don't think it's very safe. So yeah, let's go and open up Legacy iOS Kit, which is a application that allows you to do a ton of stuff with old iOS devices, like say the SH blobs. So to open up Legacy iOS Kit, I have to drag restore.sh into the terminal on Linux. It's probably now going to recommend to do something here, so I'm just gonna hit yes, and now I'm gonna have to put in my password. I may have to manually update Legacy iOS Kit, so I'm gonna go do that quickly. Okay, so I got the latest restore.sh script file, and I just put it in my folder here. So yeah, so I just have to hit yes to update it. Okay, now that we've updated, I just have to drag restore.sh back into the terminal. What I have to do here is I have to save the SH blobs, so I'm gonna get an onboard blob dump. I'm gonna have to go get an IPSW, so I'll come back. So I believe we have the iPad mini Wi-Fi model, and I think this is iPad 2.5 as it comes up here. So let me see and just make sure. Yes, iPad 2.5. So what we're going to do is we're going to go download the IPSW file for iOS 6.0.2 on the iPad mini 1st gen. So I'm gonna go get the download here. Okay, now that we've downloaded the IPSW file, I have to select it. So I'm gonna go find it. All right, all I gotta do now is just hit save onboard blobs. I'm gonna use pwn DFU, send it to recovery mode, yes, and it's now gonna pop in recovery in a minute. Okay, now I gotta put it into DFU mode, so let me do this, which is not very hard to do. So top and home button for about 8 seconds. Let go of the top button, keep holding the home button for another 8-ish seconds. All right, it's now in DFU, but that doesn't mean we can pwn it yet. We have to plug it into my Arduino Uno, and we're going to have to use a checkmate script for this thing. So yeah. Okay, I have to change something in the checkmate script to make it compatible with the iPad mini 1st gen. So I have to just change this from 8940 to 42 basically. And I should just be able to hit upload on it. And according to the message, it's just building for this A5 version, so yeah. Okay, apparently checkmate has started, but there's a chance I'm gonna have to unplug this and replug this back in because checkmate does not start off the bat sometimes. So let me actually do that quickly. Okay, I just did that. Now checkmate should start in a second. And there it goes. As you see, data status 4, that means it's pwning the device. So yeah. Okay, apparently it is now in checkmate pwn DFU mode. So the next step is to just plug this back into my computer here and go back to Legacy iOS Kit and hit enter. And it's now gonna try to save blobs. All right, and now we have booted back into iOS 6. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to jailbreak this thing with Aquila. All right, so I'm connecting this thing up to my Windows computer, and I have to go find the exe for Aquila. And apparently it's not downloaded for some reason, so I'm gonna go download it. So I'm just gonna run the script file here, run anyway. I'm gonna try to jailbreak it here, so I'll just leave you see what happens here. Okay, and supposedly it is done, so let's see what goes on with this thing. Usually it will reboot. I don't know if it has. It looks like it's in the process of doing a reboot, so yeah. And it's about to bring up the Aquila screen where it shows it like uploading the files in a second. Let's let it do its thing here. Yep, installing jailbreak, and it's now rebooting again. And we boot back into iOS 6 just like that. And we have Cydia as well and the weather app, because for some reason when these jailbreaks, they like hack the weather app onto iOS 6 iPads for some reason, which is very weird. So I'm gonna connect up to my Wi-Fi here and let's open up Cydia, shall we? And I need to grab certificates, so let me do that. Let's grab the signed iOS bundle. Now Cydia should work just like that. And yeah, there we go. That's the video. If you enjoyed this and found it interesting and or nostalgic, please consider dropping a like, subscribing with notifications on, and sharing this to someone that would do the same. Also, consider using the hype feature as it helps out the channel and the video a ton. Check out my social media accounts, which will be in the description and in the end card. I have a Twitter, a TikTok, a second YouTube channel, and a Reddit. And again, big thanks to Mac Throwback for providing the advice. And yeah, this has been Derek from Certified Legacy, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.
What we do here is go back.
Loud.